So for the ASEAN markets on a whole, or ASEAN countries as a whole, certainly there's bound to be impact. When you look at it from the US point of view, which country matters the most? That's Vietnam, in terms of because the bulk of, say, the third biggest trade deficit that US runs is with Vietnam. So what happens to their tariffs becomes quite important from a US point of view. From a regional point of view, obviously all the countries are looking at what comes out of it, and Malaysia and Singapore, some of the numbers are still awaited. So overall, I would think that sector-wise, the impact differs, but certainly higher tariffs vis-a-vis what it was before reciprocal tariffs were introduced tell us that the growth impact could be anywhere between 20 basis point to about 80 basis points, depending on the countries. So the tariffs are overall much higher, even if they're settling between 15 to 20%.
Radhika, is it safe to assume that it's more important for countries in Southeast Asia to get a deal if they have a higher percentage of their GDP based on exports? So the likes of Indonesia and the Philippines, which might see exports as a percentage of GDP below 20%, might not be under as much pressure to achieve a deal as compared to, say, the likes of Malaysia, Thailand, or Vietnam. Is that a one way to think about things, or is that framework perhaps missing certain components about why trade might be important to some of these countries?
Certainly, I think that's one metrics to look at. If you look at US exports of these countries, how much they're exporting to the US, that percentage of GDP, Vietnam is the highest, with almost a third, 30% of GDP. And if you look at countries like Philippines, Indonesia, they're about 2% of GDP. So that's one way to cut it, certainly. But that's again a top-down view, because if you look at the country-wise demarcation, let me take Indonesia for example, and if you see some of the sectors which are labor-intensive, sectors like textile, sectors like footwear, furniture, they have quite an I would say higher proportion of their exports go to the US. Sometimes it's 1/3 to a half. So which means that those industries in particular are going to certainly take a hit. So yes, I would agree with your framework, which is to keep as a percent of GDP, but I think when bottoms up, each of these countries certainly have very different dynamics. Let me cut it one more way. If you look at electronics, as a percent of GDP and exports to the US, then of course Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, Philippines, these are some countries that will be looking at these tariff rates quite keenly. And semiconductor and pharma are two sectors where we have no clarity on if and when there's going to be how much of tariff rates. And if you go by anecdotal comments, at least pharma seems to be heading towards much higher rates. So the region, while it might not make a big portion of the US imports apart from Vietnam, I would say the region would still be very keen to see where they land in terms of the final rate. And baseline has certainly risen from what we were at earlier, which was at 10%, to about 15 to 20% now. That's where we see the majority landing at this point.
And I'd like to focus on that point, the latest proclamation from U.S. President Donald Trump that says that those countries without a deal will see a baseline of about 50 to 20%. Now, this puts Singapore in a bit of a bind, though, potentially, because the agreed upon baseline tariff with Singapore, which has almost no tariffs and barriers with the U.S., was at 10%. Does that mean that the Singapore could see that potential tariff actually be at 15 to 20% if he actually makes that proclamation? Or is it still too unclear right now as to what the impact on Singapore might be?
Singapore is, just like the rest of the region, very much in discussion. We do know Singapore officials have also been visiting Washington, so that Asia, DC corridor, I would think, has been one of the busiest in the past 2-3 months. One has no clarity on where the actual tariff rate would land for Singapore. And of course, Singapore has a few strengths, because it's one of the few countries in the region which has an FTA with the US, and it does not run a deficit. US does not run a deficit, but a surplus with Singapore. So if you take that from a rational point of view, I would think that the baseline tariff should be very low. But looking at what is happening to other countries, looking at what's happening to peers, and where the range seems to be settling, I would think there's obviously a risk that it could be higher than what it was earlier as the baseline tariff.